Welcome to episode 14 of New York City Bike Culture. This is the first time I'm doing it online, and I'm very pleased to have a special guest here, John Tomlinson. He is, well, you're self-employed, if I see that correctly, right?
No, that's sort of on my online presence. I'm the head of communications at a small nonprofit organization.
Okay, I was just going to say you dabble, at least based on your online presence, in a variety of fields, including nonprofit, right? You're a longtime bike rider, bike racer. You are or have been described by former CRCA President Liz Marcello, at least, as the de facto historian of CRCA. And you chuckle, so we're going to talk more about that.
We'll talk about that later.
We're going to talk about that later. But I think that's one of the reasons I would love to talk to you. And I think there's a lot of good people with a lot of historical knowledge, but I think you've done some work there. And you've have some really interesting materials up there online that I encourage at least CRCA members to take a look at. They're really interesting. But I want to let you do the rest of the introduction. But let me say real quick first that I'd heard your name before, it had come up, or I'd seen it online or something, and then you commented on one of the first videos I posted, and I think your comment was in depth, and I think it showed some knowledge and some interests and some willingness to discuss things, and I think that I really appreciate it. So I'm really glad to talk to you. And you've also been described to me by someone recently as a full nerd the other week, as I was which I was like, this is the guy I want to talk to, I think, about history. So I'm excited to have John Tomlinson on here. John, tell us a little bit more about yourself, though.
Sure. First, I want to thank you for having me on. I was actually a little bit nervous because the way I would describe myself is sort of a grumpy old man, and I've been a grumpy old man even when I was quite a bit younger. So I'm kind of like, gotta be wary of what I say. Yeah, so professionally, I'm the head of communications at a nonprofit organization, which is interesting. Um, I went to school in librarianship, also in international relations. Um, in terms of my life and riding, I'm a longtime New Yorker. I was born in the city, grew up in the city. Was riding bikes sort of forever. I didn't ride in the city when I was very little. Probably my parents didn't let me. I definitely had a bike when I was very little once in Brooklyn, but somebody was stolen in Prospect Park, actually. A bigger kid just took it. So I don't have many memories of riding as a kid in the city, but I did. My mom was a school teacher, so on the summers we would go stay with her parents in Massachusetts, and sometimes in other places on Long Island, pretty rural place. And so I just ride my bike, little bikes all the time, just all day long, always riding bikes. And then by the time I was like a teenager, like 14 or 15, I had like an upright town bike with some gears with a 5 speed. And I rode a lot. Like I know I was riding sometimes like 20 miles one way to go fishing and 20 miles back on that bike. And I wanted to do that every day, but I was so tired I'd have to like wait a day to do it again. And then I started riding in the city in 10th or 11th grade. I live in Brooklyn, grew up in Brooklyn, but I was going to school on the Upper East Side. And so I actually got my parents to get me a road bike, and I would ride to school and home, when the weather was nice, averaging 2 or 3 days a week. And I could actually leave the bike at school too. So sometimes I ride one way and do the subway the other way. So I was riding a lot. And then in high school, in 11th grade, my school had a little bike club. The bike club really had one focus, which was a once a year event in Central Park called the Pepsi Marathon. It was a 24-hour bike marathon, 24-hour bike ride. You did loops of Central Park. We cut off the hill at the north end of the park. So it's 5 miles, and you'd start at noon and it ended at noon, and you'd ride as much as you could. And so, like 10 of us from the school with like 6 people for support, because it was like an adventure. They get permission from their parents to go out, and we had peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We had a plan. We'd ride for 2 hours. We'd stop. Our crew would give us the sandwiches. We'd ride for 2 hours. So I had a road bike. I was wearing just regular shorts and a button-down shirt, sneakers. And I rode for basically for 24 hours in Central Park. It was 250 miles. I got to see bike racers, right? We got hyped up. Then senior year, I was more excited. I got my parents to get me a real racing bike, like an equivalent of a 105 bike nowadays, a real good bike. And I started racing in CRCA, senior year of high school. and I did the bike marathon. I actually didn't go farther because even though I was all ready, I had the equipment, I had a jersey. It was pouring rain. I underdressed. It was a disaster. Um, yeah, and so that's how I got into racing. Now, senior year of high school, I joined CRCA, and I also did something in that senior year spring, which is like it's kind of crazy when I think about it. My school had we could get a diploma at the end of 11th grade. So the 12th grade, we didn't actually have to take more than 2 classes. If we did something career related or academically related or learning related in the afternoon. So I basically created a sports internship this afternoons of the spring of the senior year where I was working as a bike messenger. And so I'd call in at noon, like, hey, this is JT, I'm uptown, anything. They say, no, head down to Midtown, call again. And that was it. And I was as a bike messenger about 20, 25 hours a week for like 3 or 4 months at the end of high school. Yeah, and then I was in CRCA. I was senior in high school. I only raced in CRCA because I didn't know anybody. I didn't have a car. I couldn't go anywhere. I think you interviewed Charlie I some time ago, and it was a major junior scene at that time. I know about now. I didn't know about it then. So I was just doing the club races. I did one junior race in Central Park, Empire State Games qualifiers. I got a flat.
So can I interject real quick?
Yeah.
So you is that what the junior scene was major as you just called it, but you obviously social media and all that back in the day. So was it just a matter of not knowing the right people and the scene, despite it being major, not being as visible, and that you would just run into them? Because I mean, New York City is a big place, and from what I hear, a lot of it was out there by Casino or maybe out on Long Island, and then you from Brooklyn, Prospect Park, where you just talked about Prospect Park being a little bit more dangerous back in the day still. That it just kind of completely bypassed you.
Yeah, it just bypassed me. And everything you say is true. I think if I'd ridden in Prospect Park, I would have met people. But because I was commuting into Manhattan, I didn't do any training, right? I was doing 20 miles a day, 10 up and 10 back. And then we'd sometimes go over the bridge in the morning, me and another kid. We'd like ride up, go to New Jersey, ride back, say, we went to New Jersey before school. But so only people I'd meet. And so I'd meet people at the CRCA races, right? But CRCA races back then there were a few good riders, but they were very much training races, right? The ambitious people who wanted to travel weren't doing the training races. And certainly I didn't know how to meet people. I was just a kid. So I met 3 other kids, right? We would talk to each other, and it's not like people were mean to us, but it's hard to talk to adults and there's no introductions. So I had no clue, right? And then even if I did, I think I got Velo News. I had no way to get to races, because I didn't know anybody with a car, right? So, that's an issue. But on the other hand, it's good that I was in New York City. If I wasn't in New York City in the same situation, there would have been no races, right? I could ride to a race every weekend, right? So that was how I got started. And then then I went to college. I went to college just outside of Boston. I went to Harvard, which had a good racing-oriented cycling club, not a varsity sport, but a collegiate racing-oriented team, right? And that really opened my eyes because through that, I could travel, right? The school gave us a little bit of money, enough to rent a van 4 to 6 times a year. And there was a training series we could ride to, Wells Ave, very similar to CRCA and so and so. Yeah, it still exists. So, so now I was with other people. We could in the spring and sometimes in the fall. In the spring, we'd go every weekend for like 2 months. Driving, right? I'd see new races. So that changed everything. But I mean, I'm going to talk less about this because this is the past. I mean, you're right. No social media, no email. Back in the day, it was paper. You'd see an ad for a race. If there wasn't enough details, you would send a self-addressed stamped envelope to the promoter. They would send back the information, or you could send in a form to register with a check. They would send back the information. It was a different world.
Yeah, but it sounds like all in all, it sounds like a fairly smooth kind of trajectory. You're making it sound like that, at least that you just kind of got into it. And I mean, you're mentioning riding 20 miles to just go fishing out on Long Island, I presume, or something like that, or I don't know where you went, but you were into sports and you enjoyed bike riding then.
Yeah, I mean, when you're a young person, and when you get independence to do things on your own, that's a big change, right? I don't know. I never lived in suburbia, but suburban kids want to get their license. I had my bike. I didn't need my license, to go. I could go to school when I want, subway, go to school. In the summers, I could ride wherever I wanted. Didn't have to ask my parents, which is, so it's cool. And I remember I was riding just a few years ago, somewhere north of the city. I was on the South County Trail, like 20 miles north of the city. I saw two teenagers, two kids like 14 years old. Actually, they were fishing. And I just had to stop. I said, "What's up? You guys are fishing. This is awesome. Where are you from?" And one said, "I'm from New York City." And I'm like, "Yes." And the other kid lived nearby. He said, "This is how I ride up to meet my friend." Right. So I love I loved racing. Racing is fun. Um,
Fully agree. Yeah. So for you, this, like, yeah, you skipped kind of the junior ranks for the reasons we've just already talked about, and then you went to collegiate club, which back then I guess the scene was a little thinner, but I think a lot of universities at least have a club now where it's easier to start a club.
yeah, I wouldn't even say it was thin then. I would say it might be smaller now, but it was fine. Every weekend. Now there's A through D fields. We had A through C usually. Only one women's field, not two. I think there's typically two now. But it was robust. I mean, you could go. There were some women's races that were terrible. Where you'd show we actually I won a race in Maine. I won the A race, right? The A race was like me and five dudes, and they combined us with the 20 riders. And the women's race was the two women from my school that I drove up with, and one local woman. So there were three women. But usually it was a reasonable, it was reasonable racing. And I went to nationals twice. Once was because I continued in grad school a little bit. We went nationals. We flew to Washington State. That was full on, full field. So and there would be, I don't know if now it's 100 riders. There'd be 75. It was robust.
Yeah, no, I was in collegiate racing in Arizona, and I think the ECCC that you talk about and raced in, that is the East Coast Conference, is well known for being probably the biggest conference in the country and has big fields. And yeah, like you said, I think they even have an E field now for developing riders, and I think it's a very thriving conference. Out in Arizona, where you have like the Southwest Conference, where you're just kind of geographically limited by having to drive 6-7 hours to Albuquerque to race there, and there's only like really 4 or 5 schools in this conference. So races with 5 to 10 riders, or being combined with the 1, 2, 3 fields, like, were the norm. And it's just you can't change what you have.
Geography.
Yeah, you can't change the geography, but as you said, I think collegiate cycling has been there for a while and has a lot of potential and has brought a lot of people into the sport. For you, it kept you in the sport. Do you want to talk a little bit about I would say highlights from the racing? You mentioned going to collegiate nationals, and then after that, I think one of the things I have noted here is that I was going through some stuff online. I saw an old start list from the 1992 Fitchburg Longs Show, I think is how you say it, Classic, which still exists. I think it was much bigger back then. It was like probably 4 or 5, a long weekend. Now it's only, I think the latest edition has been down to one day crit. But you're listed a few slots below, and I think they have them ranked by numbers. The start list, the Olympic team back then with a certain Lance Armstrong, Davis Finney with the course light team was there.
Yeah.
Adam Meyerson, who that back then was a very young guy and is still racing now. Lots of others. So that must have been one of those highlights, or must have been fun, or what were some of them?
Yeah. Let me talk a little bit of that. Before I want to mention one other thing I did in college. I also actually rode across the United States. I helped organize a charity ride that went from Boston to LA. So, and I did some touring. So I like to think I've done messengering, I've done touring. I've actually never been mountain bike riding, but I kind of did a lot of stuff. In terms of racing, yeah, what happened was I did collegiate. It started as a 4, went to 3 immediately. If you do a collegiate season in a collegiate team, back then there was no category 5. Getting out of category 4, you do collegiate, you're just right out of 4 because you've just done, a lot of racing. And I think when people start racing, if you're for men at least, and this is somewhat true of women too, and you have the time to do a full season of racing. If you can get to category 2 in 1 or 2 years, you have a lot of potential. If you do a serious collegiate season, serious racing all the time, it might take a while. It took me like 6 or 7 years to get to category two. It's a sign I don't have physical potential, but I was doing stuff, go to a lot of races, consistency, get the points, right? So in the early 90s, I was a total pack fill. I was doing pro 1-2 races up and down the East Coast. And I was almost never in contention. I see the front of a race rarely, but I got to see a lot of stuff. Like you mentioned, that 92. Well, first off, I mean, we're talking about collegiate. Collegiate, I was in collegiate races against guys that went to the Olympics, after several years later. Derek Bouchard Hall, former head of USA Cycling. He was a pro. He went to the Olympics. Um, Peter Vollers was on the national team. The Carneys, stuff like that. So, collegiate was great. Then after raced collegiate for 4 years, I lived in China for a couple of years. So I was using a bike for transportation for 2 years. Came back, went to grad school. And after a couple of years, I got to category two. Then I was doing the big races, but I just was, I was just a non-contender. I spent like 4 or 5 years doing races, just riding around, trying not to get dropped. I think I got money like, let's say, I was racing probably 50 days a year, right? At all levels, not big races, 10 big races, 15 club races, bunch of local races, 50 races a year. I get money like once or twice a year, not much. But going to big races was still it was both exciting. That Fitchburg 92 was insane. Lance Armstrong won it. That was his last race as an amateur before the Olympics. I rode fine for me. Like I was in the field all the time. And that's, that race it's hard. It's like 100-mile stage on the road race, pouring rain. It was crazy. I went in really heavily dressed. A guy I knew from collegiate who was in contention, he showed up the start line like just, arm warmers. And we're like, what's up? And he's like, I'm racing today. I don't know about you guys. He just was like in the break all day. Tyler Hamilton was in it. He was one of the best regional guys. And I had a rain jacket on for 2 hours and it was getting heavy. I was like, I got to take this off. He went in underdressed. He was like shivering. I barely knew him. I'm like, dude, you want a jacket? I just gave it to him. Right. So I saw a lot of stuff and, and I was traveling around driving and, it was just fun. And then the other thing which I got out of that was, later on I did some coaching, and from riding races where you were on the limit all the time, I got good at coaching beginners, especially on how to save energy and what to look for and how to deal. You're first time you're in a criterium, there's 50 people. Oh my God, what's going on? Dude, chill. Just focus on this, focus on that, simplifying, staying calm, running things right. I coached a beginning women's team in the city. They had a lot of talent. I contributed a tiny bit. They crushed people the first stage race they went to. And they had the potential. That was all to them and their fitness. But I gave them, you're going to get overwhelmed. You're going to Fitchburg and see a lot of things. You're going to watch all the races. No. You're going to be lying down. You're going to be drinking. If you want to watch, bring a cooler. So I have some sense of sort of the knowledge of how to do bike racing, right? On the other hand, when I got older and I started doing masters races, I actually didn't have that much experience winning in races, or it took some time to gain the instinct of what to do at the end of races, right? And actually one of the first and I'm not a great masters racer. There's guys way better than me. But I I'd be like sort of the second tier. There's the 5 guys are going to be on the podium, and there's 20 guys who are, sort of doing stuff. And first year, sometimes I would be there right at the end, and I'd be like, okay, I made it. And I made it. And I'm like, what the hell? I should be trying to, place harder and this and that. So that, so you gotta, the lesson from that is you gotta mix it up and participate in races at all levels. Ones where, it's easy and you can be concentrating on winning or trying new things. Ones that are hard, where you're saving as much energy as possible, all kinds of things. So I think I got pretty good at that. I don't know if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. And I think we can hear like the passion in you. And I think that it sounds like that never really went away, that passion and that excitement. I think you make a really good point there. I mean, that Fitchburg race, that was, again, like, I think, especially today as an amateur, you very rarely have the opportunity to ride in that kind of stacked field. Because the good riders are already in Europe today, or they're in in races that you don't get into as an amateur for the most part. And arguably there's good reasons for that, but those are exciting times, right? And I think you're right that maybe then going back to a club race in Central Park was a very different feeling, and that's probably a good thing. And I think today the club races are maybe more competitive, which is maybe a good thing, but maybe also a little bit problematic, and partially because the big races regionally have kind of fallen by the wayside. So I think maybe they have grown in importance because of that then, but we can talk about that maybe later on. So maybe wrapping that kind of the personal. Do you want to comment on any of that right now?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say is that I think the biggest change is the availability of race, right? So we know in New York City, there are guys, I don't know what he's doing this year, but 2 or 3 years ago, Mike Marguerite, there are tons of guys who can be operating at the highest, non-continental pro level at times. But, the issue is, do you want to travel? Do you want to drive? Back when I was, back in the day, a guy who was good, like a Charlie he could be driving every weekend to, I would be at the back of the field. He would be at the front of the field. The prize list would be $10,000. The winner would be getting a couple $1,000, right? All the time. And just now, it's just, the issue is just the races aren't there. And it doesn't bother me. I'm just a hobby cyclist. But for the guys that want to make it to that next, and I never had any illusions of making it to that level. I just was doing it for fun. But the guys that want to make money, you had to get in your car and drive, and you could do it. Now you got to fly, There's just not enough race.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we have some really competitive amateurs, but yeah, how do you prove yourself if there aren't a lot of opportunities for that? I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think we can come back to that. We've mentioned Mike Marguerite a couple of times. He's had a bad crash, I hear, training. So I hope we wish him all the best. I hope I'll have him on the show at some point. Maybe we can talk about things too, and then something related to that. But yeah, good. Best of luck to him with recovery. So today, can you talk a little bit about how did you mentioned masters racing, and you sounded like you've always been excited about that. So how do you see your role or position? What do you do as a cyclist? Are you still connected to the community? You're obviously paying attention. You're observing. How are you still in it?
Yes. So from the late 90s through the first decade of this 20th century, I was on a masters teams based in New York, pretty good ones. One that's not around anymore, called Metro SBCG. And we would be second or third in the A men's team cup in CRCA. So we were a good team in CRCA. We never were the best team. And we would go to regional masters races, of which there were also a lot. We won Killington, we won Fitchburg, we won the Somerville Masters Criterium. These are all in the Masters. So we were good. And in that period of time, I was very involved in the club, which I'll talk about. Around 2008, I went to grad school in librarianship, and I started dialing it back while working. So I kind of didn't have that much time, so I started dialing it back. And also, I had a son in 2012, and I had to dial it back a lot. So I don't think I've raced for 3 or 4 years. I was always someone who would go into. It's better to go into a race undertrained than overtrained. So I tended to get away with doing very little. But when you do very little and then you cut it back a lot, you got nothing, right? Some people are like, oh, they were overtrained for 10 years, then they had a child, they stopped riding, suddenly they got better. I got way worse. So I've actually, frankly, been fairly out of the scene for 5 or 8 years. Just, with social media makes things possible, right? I observe people. I'm ostensibly still on Dino's Wonder Wheel, but I haven't raced in several years. I actually helped do their team duty. I think last year, the year before, it was like their liaison to the club. So I'm kind of losing it, but I want to get back. And so I'm hoping that my boy, he's in 3rd grade now. By the time he's in 6th grade, he'll be independent, going to school. I'll be able to ride. I just basically can't ride except on the weekends right now. Because I deal with the whole my wife is not home in the morning, so I'm just doing everything from whatever. So I'm more of an observer. Through grad school, I think in my 1st or 2nd semester, I had to, in one of the fundamental classes, Librarianship is about knowledge management and organizing the organization of information. Sometimes it's called cataloging. And we had to pick a project of a collection to catalog. And the CRCA president at the time, who I had been on the board with, had just gotten somebody called him up and said, I've got 12 boxes from some guy named Lou Maltese, who was a friend of my father's, or this or that. It was this huge collection, not huge, it was 10 or 12 bankers' boxes of papers of CRCA history. And so that was a collection I organized using archival principles. Went through it, looked at it, what's the content, arranged in a certain way as it would be done in an archive, which was very interesting. So that's been my last big contact with the club. Then Liz Marcello, who was president for a number of years, including about 5 years ago, the same thing happened to her. Somebody called her up, said, I've got some papers of CRCA records. We're like, what? And it was a second set, overlapped some of the stuff, but we got together a bunch of people from the club and we sort of went through it. That's why Liz calls me a historian. The truth of the matter is, those records are just sitting in storage, right? And to really be used, they need to be accessible. And I've just been too busy. I need to work. We need to make a proposal to New York Public Library, New York Historical Society, Museum of the City of New York. This is what we have. Would you be willing to take it into your collection, right? With a proviso that people can have access to it, right? And because New York City real estate's very expensive, these institutions are not begging for stuff. I'm sure that if we pitch it right, they will take it, but they're not like scouring the world because this, and so that's, if I could get some time, that would be the project, to really write some proposals. We also looked into, Liz encouraged me, we looked into what would it cost to scan all of that to make it accessible ourselves. It's not cheap, it's not expensive. It's, like $30,000 to $50,000. And what does that mean? And do you keep it on a server? How do people find it? So there are some issues, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say this has been sitting around for 10 years. But anyway.
I think that's the nature of things with volunteer work, right? I mean, I think, and especially these kind of projects that aren't probably ever considered urgent, right? And I think this is good. This is something we wanted to talk about anyway, right? I think you're not a historian by trade, but I think you through your grad school work, I think you were able to kill two birds with one stone at the time, and then life comes in between. But it sounds like there's a really interesting, archival, maybe even a book project for someone there.
For sure. I mean, I'll say what's interesting is that, so I've looked at, there's got to be, I have it written down. There's just tens of thousands of pages of material and photographs and flyers and all kinds of stuff like that. But it's very rich. There's a lot of information in there. Like, for example, I was listening to your interview with Charlie I, and he was saying his father was in a German bicycle sports club. That's what his father raced in. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff in there from GSBC, right? And there's all kinds of stuff in there. And I think actually Charlie said the club isn't around. He's mistaken. The club is Carl Hart, which you see in Prospect Park races. That's GBSC, that still exists. And so there's all kinds of really interesting stuff. There's a lot of stuff. He was talking about immigrant communities, right? And you can see there was all these immigrant communities that formed the different clubs, and then they would compete. And some still exist. There's GBSC still exists. There's USI, Union Sportivo Italiano, which is a Westchester-based club. A lot of black cyclists in that club right now, but it was originally a way for Italian immigrants who are into sports to get involved in stuff. So there's a lot of stuff like that. You can tell there was kind of a dark ages in the 60s. Stuff is kind of a mess, right? And then there's material up into the 80s and 90s. And now, there's a challenge because everything's digital. And what does that mean? And all the club stories are online on the website, and we change, hosting environments, we change content management systems. What happens to the archives? So, it's something to be aware of and worry about. It's not super important, but it's interesting.
No, I think it is, and I think there's probably already a bit of a black hole developing for the last 20 years where everything was moved online and stuff gets deleted from the website and it's gone, right? I mean, I think that's how simple it can be sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that, oh gosh, this is somebody I think I've never met in person. The guy that runs the To Be Determined website.
Yeah, Matt Vandervoort.
Yes. So I know he cares about this. And I know when he did some of the transfers, I told him about old stuff, and he's held on to it. And so he's been doing a great job as far as I'm aware, but it's something that's there can be a design, people not pay attention for 2 years and everything's lost, right?
Sounds we need to rally a few people in the community and maybe do a little bit of history project.
Yeah, but then it's like, what's more important? It's more important to put on races. That's the contradiction.
I think that's always in the end, right? The calculation that's being made, right? I think put your energy into making sure the club continues to exist and to succeed, and then races are happening. And I agree.
We'll see. Who knows? Maybe when I retire in 10 to 15 years, I'll be
Well,
riding a little more. And
for those who are interested, I think I'll put if you don't mind, I'll put the links to the documents you created back then in the show notes. And I think even though not all the materials are scanned, there's a description of the materials that are in there, and I think that's really interesting. So on that note, having had that much insight into, at least because you're getting certain perspective and snippets of history, and like you said there, you've already said there's a bit of a black hole, or the 60s for some reason, maybe for certain reasons, maybe it's just because the person who was collecting materials wasn't paying attention to the 60s, right? There was a bit of a lack of materials. What stood out to you looking at the history of an organization that has existed since, what is it, 1898?
Yeah, 1898. So, actually, it's funny because I was on the board in 1998, and we actually had a 100th anniversary celebration, and we did a little history project. We actually hired a historian who wrote a little club history, and I think that's on the website right now. The sport changed a lot, right? So you can tell that in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, it was one of the biggest sports around, right? And there were clippings from, major events in Madison Square Garden, and Lou Maltese, who you guys, everybody hears the name of it. I joined the club in 83. Lou Maltese was an old man running the races out of the back of his car, right? He would drive up his car and all the cones would be in there, and he'd get his team to set things up. I knew Lou Maltese as an old guy. Then people were like, no, back in the day, he was hardcore. And I'm like, do you know that? Nobody knew that because it was in the 30s. And in the 30s, there's a program from Montreal 6-day race. It's a program of the 12 racers and where they're from, and they're from Europe, and there's Lou Maltese and what they've won. It was a big professional sport, not a big money sport, but it was a pro sport back at that time. And then there's amazing stuff, even into the 50s, where there would be race flyers of races in New York City. You're like, oh my God, they raced there? Even in when I was, even not from the archives, but when I started racing, there was a race around Union Square, right? I'm pretty sure Charlie was in. I was watching a race that went up and down Fifth Avenue and into Central Park. Greg LeMond was in that, right? There were some big races, and there were races, here and there and all these things. So that's what struck out to me, big races. In the 20s and 30s, and earlier, maybe a little later, a big social scene. There were flyers from the club banquets and the menus and all this and that. Then, the 60s, 70s, it looked to me like cycling in the U.S. wasn't doing so well. The guys that were leaders in New York, Lou Maltese and Al Tofield in particular, were big deals in cycling in the nation, right? So they were among the officiating and promoting of the sport and keeping the sport alive through those years. And so, maybe we're known as the best riders came out of California and Wisconsin and Colorado, but the famous promoters who were keeping the sport alive, at least in our collection, maybe there's a collection out west, different, but you could see they were playing a major role in keeping the sport alive, right? So that's what I tended to notice. Then,
so does that real quick then maybe gives you a little bit more time to think about the other stuff too. Are you someone who feels a little bit of nostalgia for days past, but you weren't necessarily part of that, but do you feel like, now today, cycling's had, with everything that's going on, and cycling, the scene feels maybe less important or prominent? Do you feel sad about that, or how do you feel about that?
For me, where I'm in life, it's no big deal. But not so much from the archives, but what I was saying about racing in the 80s and the 90s, if you were an up-and-coming racer who had potential, it's a lot harder now. So I'm in a Facebook group called Classic New England Cycling. And people sometimes, they put up photos from, just races in, 1997. And you look at it like, geez, look at the crowd at the finish line. There were just crowds, even park races. Mangoni, there would be a crowd at the finish line, and now less so. So that's I feel nostalgia for that. I don't and then the historic stuff, it's interesting. But really just, but on the other hand, cycling is doing great. Bike racing might not be doing great, but more people are riding bikes than ever. There's events, there's fondos, there's gravel grinders, there's commuters. I think we need to just cherish what we have. Um, so yeah, I don't know if nostalgia is the right word. I'm interested in stuff, and I feel wistful for just in terms of somebody wanting to be really good in New York City. It's rough now.
Yeah, and I guess, like you've said, we can make the calculation, say, okay, for that 1% of racers at the top end, it's harder, but for everybody else, it's better.
Yeah, although maybe not so much for racing. So right now, like, I look around, I don't even know what's going on, but I look around, there's racers like I don't even these are people I don't even know. On the women's side, like Amy Cutler a few years ago, though she stopped riding, there would be Britley Bowman, these people that are ambitious that were traveling, right? And so they've got it hard. But there is a big value to having a richer racing scene locally, because those people, when they're local, you know, raise the game, right? So we've certainly, and I got to be really careful. I haven't been in a Club A race in like 6 years. I'm not dissing the A riders. They're super fast, right? But we got a buzz when, Prospect Park, people are like, yo, Mike McCarthy's in town. He's going to be a prospect this weekend. He was in Europe last weekend. It's like there's a certain buzz there that by the sport being bigger, actually, I heard something, it sounded so ridiculous, but it actually was true. I was at some race somewhere, I don't even remember. And some guy was walking around, he was Cat 4. And his friend came by to see this, and he said, what's going on? He said, I'm in this race. And they said, really? Well, how good are you? And he said, well, I'm at the bottom of the Olympic pyramid. And then and I was listening, and I was like, yeah, there's me, and then there's guys above me, and there's guys above me, and guys above me, and guys above me. But we all race, we're trying to go up. It's the Olympic pyramid. And there's some truth to that, And back in the day, we would those of us that were ambitious, me not ambitious in being good, but even on my master's team where we would travel, we would go to races. We were like, we're going places, we're seeing new things, we're doing tactics, we're learning to climb. We would almost be dismissive of people that would only race in the park. We're like, oh, he's just a park racer. And they'd be good. They could beat us in the park, but they never dealt with a sharp corner. They never dealt with a hill. They never dealt with a course where you didn't see the finish until the end because there was a one loop, stuff like that. And that's a problem even now, because the people who do that come back and they really impress on, that's why it's kind of a vicarious excitement. I follow some of the blogs to see the guys who are traveling, even not traveling as ones and twos, even traveling as threes. That turns me on. And the women that are traveling, I'm like, yeah, get out there and show them.
Yeah, I'm 100% with that. I think I started actually bike racing in college too, as a PhD student, and out in Arizona. Again, maybe it was a more isolated scene, but coming to New York was really interesting to me, that there's these big races with big turnouts, but they all feel a little bit, and again, this is not dismissive, they feel a little bit like training races, even though they're raced very seriously, because it's the same courses over and over and the same people over and over. And there's relatively little people coming from the outside into New York City to race in New York City and compete. So you race the same people, which after a while, oh, I know how to beat that guy. I need to be on that wheel because they're super strong. And that really changes the way you're racing. So there's a lot of talent here, but I think what is missing, I've talked about this with other people too, and maybe it's not missing, it is missing, but maybe we don't need that. But in Arizona, you would have, because of what Arizona is and what it has to offer, you would have, especially in the spring when Arizona's main race season is, you would have the random pro or two jump into the local races, and you'd be like, oh, that's what top level racing looks like. Okay, and it changed the strategy of the race, because it was, all right, that guy goes, and there was a young Brandon McNulty who's now in the pro ranks, and everybody was like, there's that 16-year-old or 17-year-old who the whole field was covering. It was there was a crit where for 60 minutes there's a young kid attacking and on junior gears, and everybody is trying to cover him as best as they can. And those are good memories, like you mentioned racing and Lance Armstrong. So that's maybe missing, but I think, like you said, there's a lot of power to that. The racing here is safe by and large, even though even with the big fields, like you said, there's no real turns, and by and large the courses are fairly wide. and yes, we have to worry about other people in the parks, but by and large, and I worry sometimes about people from New York City never learning the corner a lot. But I think it has a lot to offer too, right? So
Yeah, I mean, you're really onto something, and I think the clubs are doing CRCA and Charlie. If you look at we've got Casina, we've got Grant's Tomb once a year, we've got Harriman, right? We've got the parks. It's okay. When I was on the board in the late '90s into the 2000s, we did something um very different than now, and I don't know the whole situation within the board, but and this was particularly under one of my best friends, Eugene Barno, but a number of other people who had the position of um, VP of racing and VP of open racing, where we believed in trying to diversify the races as much as possible, and in particular, have trying to draw a firm line between a club race and an open race, right, and prospect. And one of the parts of that was that, just as an example, and I'm not saying this is what we should be doing now, but certainly back then, I believed in this very strongly, was the team series was not every race. The team series was like 5 races or 7 through the season. We had more races. So let's say we had 21 races. They might have 15 now. So it was about a quarter of the races was the team series. Those were scheduled where there were not major regional races. So those were like an appointment, right? And those were bigger. They felt, oh, Jesus, Team Cup this weekend. It's like a big deal. Whereas opposed to Team Cup every week, it's just the same, right? So Team Cup, and then a weekend when there's no Team Cup, yeah, well, I'm going to Somerville, I'm going to New Jersey, I'm going to whatever, right? And the club race was like a fallback, right? So more distinction like that, and in particular, never a team series in the lower category men's races. It's an oxymoron. You cannot be the best Cat B rider. You should be in the A, right? So this is something we believed in. On the other hand, the series do help with turnout. I know why Charlie has a turnout, and it creates a certain dynamic. That's an interesting dynamic of what's going on and why is this happening? You know, and sometimes, on the one hand, new racers from the city, we tended to, this is a broad generalization. For guys in the city, crits, some fantastic crit riders, a lot of park riders who don't go to enough crits, they could be great. We don't race up enough hills. On the other hand, the city racers, we tend to be better at making the race based on tactics and not the terrain, right? There was a race that used to exist. It was a master stage race in Rhode Island, 3 stages over 2 days for many years. And the road stage was similar to Central Park, about twice as long, but the same terrain. I had these friends from New England. They're like, oh, man, there's no hills. You never need the small chain ring. It's just going to be a field sprint. They would just whine. And every time I went there with at least 2 teammates, one of us was in the break, and it was not a field sprint. If my team was there, guaranteed to not be a field sprint. And these people would have no idea. Not that we're strong. They would have no idea what's going on. They were like, well, you break away on the hills. And we're like, no. We break away, when the wind is going to shift, or there's a corner, or there's a this or that, or we do nothing. And then suddenly 10 miles from the end, we're just trading attacks. And people are like, what the hell? Where'd these guys come from? So, there's some value to that. And there's certain value, as a coach, I was very interested in, you need to be in unfamiliar situations to be able to deal with unfamiliar situations, right? But you also need to practice in familiar situations so you can make yourself the variable, right? I'm going to sit in longer, or I'm going to attack more, or I'm going to ride more to the front, I'm going to ride more to the back. So there's huge learning opportunities in the city, right? And even when I got to the point where I can't even hang in a CRCA race very well, I'll be at the back, or particularly in the early season, you have new goals. Oh, my goal is ride in the first 20 all race, or do this or do that. So, we have a gem here. That's a problem too, but there's a big plus side to it.
no, I think you're right. I think there's value to that repetition, right? Of really figuring out how can I win, or how can I do better on this particular finish. And when you go to a crit that's somewhere in Office Park, well, you don't have another chance until next year, right, to figure out how to race this particular course. And I think it does make you better as a racer, or you're out on Floyd Bennett and you learn how to race in crosswinds. I think that's really completing you as a racer, because you really have to think a lot about positioning too. And in a big pack, you really also can really benefit from positioning and understanding what it's like to be riding in the front, or 20th position, or in the back, or in the middle, and how that changes the way you can race. I think there's a lot of value to that, because if you look at another way, I don't think there is a single race series, and maybe the driveway series out in Austin, Texas is another big one. But I don't think there's anything that draws 110 1-3 field racers like in Prospect Park or big numbers for CRCA races week after week almost over the summer in the whole country. So I think we have a fantastic thing here. But I think it's important also to talk about the upsides and the downsides, or the pluses and the minuses, whatever you want to call it. So. Coming back to you maybe before we take a little break and then change to another topic, but you as a racer, what were some of the things that you really enjoyed, or what were some of the courses, the races you really enjoyed, or maybe some of these highlights that you can point to, other than is there a particular race, are there particular memories, are there particular things that you miss now that you're not racing?
Well, I miss the process of the travel and the planning, especially with people of like focused on it, and where's the planning and the hotel and the packing. And I'm a little bit OCD in a certain way about clothes and stuff. And it's like, oh, it's going to be raining. Oh, what do you bring in? Getting it right. I miss that stuff. Right. And now, if I sometimes I travel like once or twice a year to a gravel grinder. It's very weird, like having to pack your bag. When in the past, my bag was like always packed. And I knew what to take. So I missed that. The bigger the race, the big race that I could finish was always the funnest thing. And just being pack fill, I really like big races, but where I could finish, which isn't always the case, right? Because it's like, Fitchburg Pro 1, 2, I could just barely finish, barely. Killington stage race was 5 days, 300-mile stages, never finished it. The last 100-mile stage, I always would just drop 10 miles in. I just couldn't handle it. I never finished it. But it was still fun to just be in a big field, and not even the biggest races. But if you go to a big road race, there's 100 guys, it's single file, and you're like, geez, it's single file. You're like, what's going on? What's going on? And then the last half hour, you're up there. You look around. There's only 20 or 30 people. Very satisfying. So I just love the practice of it. I don't really love training. I never was a big trainer. I love riding, but I ride really slow. Back in the day, I think a lot of people tended to be overtrained. Training now is a lot more precise. So I think people are aware of overtraining, particularly with training with power meters, things like that. When I was racing particularly as a 3, so many people didn't know what the hell they were. And they would just crush me all week long. They would be nowhere in the races, or they would show up in race and they would just be all over the place. And then afterwards, they'd say, how'd you go down? I'd be like, I got third. And it's like, I never saw you. And it's not like I was a sprinter, but just like, I would just, So I love the guile of it. I don't really like races where it's 100% on strength. And I'm a little bit dismissive of coaches even we've had some coaches even in the area who are just super strong. And coaching is about figuring things out. It's not about being the strongest. There is coaching for fitness, but I really like the guile of it. And that's why I love, like, locally, we have guys like Charlie the Pineda brothers who don't race right now, super, super clever riders. Kevin Malloy, who I don't know if he's riding right now. These are guys that are so smooth, so calculating. They'll be like, where are they? Where are they? And then suddenly they're up there. When they're up there, you got to go. Like, I love that stuff of the tactics. And even if I don't know what's going on, it's like, the cerebral aspect to it.
That's exactly what I like about it too, versus say running, where you go as hard as you can. And I mean, yes, there's some tactics involved, but by and large, the strongest runner wins. And in bike racing, there's so much more to it. And I think those mental gymnastics that chess game, whatever you want to call it, I think that brings a lot of fascination. And maybe not to the people who are the fittest, but to those of us who aren't, that's the majority of us who aren't the best, then that makes it possible for us to get really excited, even though we know it's going to be hard for us, right?
Yeah, and there's guys, you hear the names, Mike McCarthy, Liz Emery, George Hincapie. They sometimes were the fittest, and they had this attitude, and that's how they're so great.
Yeah. All right, well, let's take a short break.